The sun had barely started rising over the rolling fields of Sheriff Tom's farm, casting golden hues across the land. The smell of fresh earth mixed with the distant sound of roosters crowing as Tom stepped out onto his porch, stretching his arms. Though he had spent decades enforcing the law in his small town, nothing gave him more peace than working on his family farm. His land had been in his family for generations, acres of wheat fields, a sturdy red barn, and pastures where his cattle grazed. He had always found a deep satisfaction in tending to it, a stark contrast to the often chaotic and stressful life of law enforcement. As he walked towards the stables to check on his horses, he saw his wife, Sarah, feeding the chickens. Their farm wasn't just a source of food. It was their way of life. Locals would often stop by to buy fresh produce, milk, and eggs. Many of the town's officers even got their groceries from him, knowing the quality of homegrown food couldn't be beaten. But that peaceful existence was about to be shattered. A few months ago, a new upscale housing development had been built right next to Tom's land. It was filled with well-manicured lawns, uniform houses, and a strict HOA that believed they controlled everything within sight. The new residents, mostly city transplants, didn't understand country living. They complained about the smell of livestock, the sound of tractors in the morning, and even the dust that blew in on windy days. And then came Karen. She had moved in just a few weeks ago but had already taken control of the HOA, using her newfound power to dictate what she believed was acceptable for the neighborhood. And in her eyes, Tom's farm was not acceptable. She had already made her presence known, sending formal complaints to his mailbox about the unsightly nature of his barn and the excessive noise from his animals. Tom had ignored them at first, knowing full well that HOA rules didn't apply to his farm. But Karen wasn't the type to back down. And soon, she would make her move. It started with the letters. Karen, in her typical entitled fashion, began sending official-looking HOA notices to Tom's mailbox. Each one was more absurd than the last. Your roosters are in violation of noise ordinances. The barn's color clashes with community aesthetic. Please repaint it within 30 days. Livestock odors are negatively affecting property values. Immediate action required. Tom chuckled as he read them over breakfast. He knew she had no legal ground, but Karen's persistence was almost admirable. He crumpled the latest letter and tossed it in the trash, turning his attention back to his coffee. Sarah wasn't as amused. She's going to escalate, she warned, setting down her mug. People like her don't stop when they don't get their way. Tom sighed, leaning back in his chair. Let her try. This is my land, and she has zero authority over it. And try she did. Karen started harassing the local council, demanding they enforce residential codes on the farm. The town officials, familiar with Tom and his property's legal standing, shut her down immediately. Next, she organized a neighborhood petition to remove unsanitary farm activities from the area. Most of the HOA members didn't sign. Many actually enjoyed buying fresh eggs and produce from Tom's farm. But Karen wasn't deterred. One morning, Tom awoke to find for sale signs staked into his front yard. His phone buzzed nonstop with calls from real estate agents, all claiming they'd been contacted about purchasing the property. Karen was trying to sell his land out from under him. That was the last straw. Tom marched straight to her house, knocking hard on her pristine white door. When she answered, she looked at him with an almost bored expression, like she had better things to do than deal with him. Karen, Tom said, his voice steady. Take the signs down. Now. She smirked. I don't know what you mean. Tom took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Listen carefully. This land has been in my family for generations. I'm not going anywhere. The HOA has no power over my farm. Karen crossed her arms. That may be true now, but people like you don't belong here. This is a respectable community. Maybe it's time for a change. Tom clenched his jaw. He had faced hardened criminals in his career, but somehow, this woman was just as infuriating. He turned on his heel and walked away. He had bigger things to worry about than some power-hungry suburban queen. But Karen wasn't finished. The next morning, she made her boldest move yet. She called the police. And she had no idea who she was messing with. Karen thought she had one. Standing on her perfectly trimmed lawn, phone in hand, she spoke in a dramatic, exasperated tone to the local sheriff's department. Yes, hello. I'd like to report a serious issue in our neighborhood. There's a suspicious man running some sort of illegal operation. There are animals everywhere. and I'm quite certain he's violating multiple zoning laws. It's completely unacceptable. On the other end of the line, the dispatcher side. It wasn't the first time Karen had called in a complaint about something that wasn't a real emergency. But policy required them to send someone to check it out. Karen smirked. Soon, Tom would be drowning in legal trouble. Maybe even forced to leave. That was her biggest mistake. 20 minutes later, a police SUV pulled up to Tom's farm. Karen stood proudly at the edge of the property, arms crossed, watching as the officer stepped out. She was ready to see Tom get what he deserved. But as the officer removed his sunglasses, her confidence vanished. Because the man standing in front of her wasn't just some regular officer. It was Tom. Sheriff Tom Richards. Her jaw nearly hit the floor. The man she had been harassing for weeks wasn't just a farmer. He was the actual sheriff of the county. Tom took his time, adjusting his uniform, before stepping forward. "Morning, Karen." His tone was casual, but the smirk on his face was impossible to miss. Karen blinked rapidly. "Wow, what is this? Why are you wearing a police uniform?" Tom rested a hand on his belt. "Because I am the police." Karen's face turned red. She sputtered. "No, that's not possible. You're a farmer." Tom chuckled. "I'm both. Sheriff by day, farmer by night." He gestured toward his land. "I told you before, you have no authority here." Karen looked at the officer standing next to Tom, as if expecting him to disagree. But the younger deputy just shrugged, clearly amused. "We heard there was a problem, ma'am," the deputy said, barely suppressing a grin. "But looks like everything's in order." Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She had called the law on the law, and now she was in trouble. Because filing a false police report, that was a real crime. Karen's face twisted in disbelief. No. This isn't right. There's something illegal happening here. He has all these animals running around. And what about the smell? That has to be a violation." Tom exhaled, shaking his head. "Karen, do you even understand how farms work?" He waved his arm around. "This land has been here for generations. I have permits for everything. Livestock, crops, structures. You, on the other hand, just wasted department resources on a false call." Karen's confidence crumbled further. She hadn't expected this. She thought she could manipulate the system the way she always did in the HOA. But this wasn't some neighbor she could bully into submission. This was the sheriff. The deputy beside Tom pulled out his notepad. "Ma'am, do you realize filing a false report is a Class A misdemeanor? You're accusing a man of illegal activity on his own legally operated farm." Karen paled. "Wait, what? No, I was just..." Tom crossed his arms. "Do you know how many real emergencies we handle daily? Domestic disputes, thefts, missing persons? But instead of responding to those, we're here because you don't like the smell of farm animals." Karen was speechless. For once, she had no snappy comeback, no legal loophole, no HOA rule to throw in his face. Then Tom smirked. "Tell you what, Karen, I won't press charges yet. But from now on, you stay on your side of the fence, and I stay on mine. You got a problem with my farm." He leaned in slightly. "You take it up with the sheriff." Karen swallowed hard. "But you are the sheriff." Tom tipped his hat. "Exactly." The deputy scribbled something in his notepad. "And for the record, this will be documented. If you ever misuse emergency services again, there will be legal consequences." Karen's face flushed deep red. She had lost. But deep inside, she wasn't done yet. She just had to find another way. And Tom knew it. That's why he wasn't letting his guard down. Karen stormed back to her house, fuming. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. She paced around her pristine living room, flipping through the HOA handbook, searching for anything she could use against Tom. If she couldn't beat him with the law, she'd weaponize the HOA. Then she found it. A zoning regulation about unsightly properties and community harmony. If she could rally the HOA board, they could file a formal complaint against his farm. Enough complaints, and they could force an investigation, maybe even push for fines. The next day, she called an emergency HOA meeting. A small group of her loyal followers, other homeowners who hated the farm's presence, gathered in her living room. Karen stood at the front, clutching a clipboard. "This farm is a blight on our community," she declared. "We can't let some backwoods sheriff turn this place into a barnyard. It's driving down our property values." A woman in the back raised a hesitant hand. "But his farm was here long before this HOA was established. Legally, he has the right." Karen slammed her hand on the table. "We make the rules now." The room went silent. Karen took a deep breath, then smirked. "We're filing a formal complaint. If we work together, we can make his life miserable. He won't want to keep fighting us forever." The HOA board members exchanged glances. Some looked unsure, but others nodded. They were in, and Tom had no idea what was coming. The very next morning, Tom woke up to a letter taped to his barn door. "Notice of community violation." Tom frowned as he unfolded the paper. According to the HOA, his farm was now classified as a visual nuisance and a disruption to the peaceful aesthetics of the neighborhood. The letter warned that if he didn't bring his property up to community standards, he could face fines or even legal action. Tom let out a deep chuckle. He'd been expecting something like this. Just then, he noticed a few HOA board members standing on the sidewalk, watching him. Karen stood among them, arms crossed, her lips curled into a smug grin. Tom sighed. So, they wanted to play this game? Fine. But it didn't stop there. That afternoon, a county inspector randomly showed up to check if his farm was violating any zoning laws. A few days later, HOA members started calling animal control, claiming his livestock was dangerous to the community. Someone even reported his well water for possible contamination, forcing him to go through unnecessary testing. It was blatant harassment, and Tom knew exactly who was behind it. Karen thought she was backing him into a corner. What she didn't realize was that she was about to pick a fight with the wrong man. Tom had spent years enforcing the law. He knew exactly how to handle this kind of harassment. Instead of reacting impulsively, he documented everything. He saved copies of every violation notice and recorded every visit from county inspectors. He installed a security camera system around his property to catch any trespassers. He even had a friend at the county office look into whether Karen and her HOA board were misusing local regulations. Then he started digging into the HOA's own rules. And that's when he found a loophole. It turned out that while the HOA had power over residential properties, his farm was legally classified as agricultural land, meaning the HOA had absolutely no legal authority over him. Tom smirked. This was about to get interesting. But before he could put his plan into action, the HOA made their next move. One morning, Karen showed up at the farm with two uniformed officers. Tom, standing in his barn, watched as she marched toward him, arms swinging with self-importance. "Sheriff or not, you can't just ignore HOA rules," she snapped. "These officers are here to make sure you comply." Tom stayed calm. He turned to the officers and, with a slow grin, pulled out his own badge. "Gentlemen, I appreciate you doing your job, but you might want to check who actually has jurisdiction here." The officers exchanged glances. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Karen's smug expression faltered as she realized she just made a huge mistake. The moment Tom flashed his badge, the officers stiffened. They weren't expecting to see the county sheriff himself standing in front of them. One officer cleared his throat. Sheriff, we didn't realize." Tom cut him off with a calm but authoritative tone. "I understand, boys. You were just doing your job. But let me make something clear." He turned to Karen, whose face was rapidly losing color. "This farm is legally outside of HOA jurisdiction. You have no authority here. And if you keep harassing me, we're going to have a real problem." Karen tried to recover. I was just making sure our community is safe." "You're disrupting the neighborhood." Tom chuckled. "Disrupting? Karen, I grow food. I raise livestock. I provide fresh produce to the local market. If anything, I make this community better." Karen's lips thinned, but she wasn't backing down. "You still have violations. Your farm is an eyesore, and I will take this to the county board if I have to." Tom tilted his head. "You mean the same county board that I personally work with? The same one that approved my farm's zoning status?" Karen opened her mouth, then snapped it shut. The realization was sinking in. She had just tried to bring the law down on the law itself. But she wasn't done yet. Tom could see it in her eyes. She was scheming. And sure enough, a few days later, she made her next move. Karen wasn't one to give up easily. If she couldn't use the police to shut Tom down, she'd find another way. A few days later, Tom received an official-looking letter in the mail. It was from the HOA's legal team, demanding that he cease all farming activities immediately due to community violations. Tom shook his head, amused. Nice try, Karen. He called his lawyer, a no-nonsense guy named Mark, who laughed when he read the letter. They don't have a legal leg to stand on, Tom. Your land is zoned for agricultural use. The HOA has no authority here. Still, Tom knew Karen wouldn't stop. And sure enough, later that evening, he saw a group of HOA board members gathering outside his fence. They were pointing at his barn, whispering among themselves. Then they did something he couldn't believe. One of them pulled out a clipboard and started taking photos of his property. Another one walked over to his livestock pen, inspecting his animals. Tom's patience was wearing thin. He walked up to them, hands on his hips. Can I help you folks with something? Karen smirked. Just documenting all the health and safety violations, Sheriff. We'll be reporting this to the county health department. Tom narrowed his eyes. You mean the same health department that I've worked with for years? The one that just gave me an A+ inspection last month? Karen's smug expression faltered. I've had enough of this, Karen, Tom said, his voice turning steely. You're harassing me. You're trespassing. And if you don't leave my property in the next 30 seconds, I'll have no choice but to treat you like any other lawbreaker. Karen huffed, but she could see the officers still standing nearby, watching the interaction. Finally, she stomped off, her little group of HOA board members scurrying behind her. But Tom knew this wasn't over. Karen was going to try one more desperate move. And this time, it was going to backfire spectacularly. The next day, as Tom was finishing his morning rounds, he heard a strange rumbling sound coming from the direction of the farm entrance. It wasn't the usual sound of tractors or trucks. This was a large, heavy vehicle approaching. Tom stepped outside to see a bulldozer heading toward his property, escorted by a few unfamiliar men in construction gear. They were coming straight for his farm's main building. He immediately recognized the look on their faces. It wasn't just construction workers. It was a private demolition crew hired by someone to destroy his property. Tom's instincts kicked in, and he immediately grabbed his phone to call Mark, his lawyer. But before he could dial, he saw Karen standing at the entrance of the farm with a clipboard in hand. What is this, Karen? Tom shouted, walking toward her. Karen smiled triumphantly. I've called in a crew to clear out all these so-called violations. It's for the good of the community, Sheriff. Tom's blood ran cold. He knew Karen had crossed the line now. She'd hired a crew without proper permits, and the only thing they were clearing out was her chance to win. Without wasting a second, Tom pulled out his sheriff's badge. He walked up to the crew leader, showing it to him. You're trespassing on private property, and this is a legal farm with no violations. If you don't leave now, you'll be arrested for criminal activity. The crew leader looked at Tom and hesitated. The construction crew, realizing the seriousness of the situation, began to back up. Karen's smug face turned pale as she realized what had just happened. You can't do this. I'm doing what's right, Karen shouted, but Tom was already in full control of the situation. You've overplayed your hand, Karen. The only thing you're doing is wasting your time, and now I've got enough evidence to take you down. Tom dialed his fellow officers, explaining the situation. Within minutes, a police car arrived, and Tom filed a formal report of trespassing and harassment against Karen. The demolition crew, realizing they were in hot water, packed up and left. Karen, however, was still standing at the edge of the farm, her face flushed with anger and defeat. But Tom wasn't finished yet. You've tried everything, Karen. Now it's my turn. As Karen stood there, seething with frustration, Tom made sure to have his legal team handle the formal complaints against her. She had gone too far this time, and there was no way she could escape the consequences of her actions. The next day, Tom arranged for a formal investigation into the illegal demolition attempt that Karen had initiated. The county sheriff's office began to look into the matter seriously, and the contractors who had been involved in the botched attempt were also questioned. By then, word had spread quickly through the community about Karen's attempt to seize control of the farm. Her reputation as the self-appointed HOA enforcer was rapidly tarnishing. Many of the neighbors who had previously been intimidated by her authoritarian demeanor were now beginning to openly side with Tom and his farm. But Tom wasn't done with Karen yet. His legal team worked tirelessly to ensure that every angle was covered. The final blow came when Tom discovered that Karen had been sending harassing letters to the local zoning committee and had even tried to convince some of the other property owners in the area that Tom's farm was violating regulations, all without any actual evidence. The sheriff's office began to press charges against Karen for harassment, false reporting, and even the unlawful use of contractors without proper authority. Days later, Karen received a letter in the mail from Tom's legal team, notifying her of the formal charges against her. It also included a cease and desist order for any future attempts to interfere with Tom's property. Tom made sure that the next time Karen tried to meddle, she would have no legal grounds to stand on. He knew she would try again, but now she was on the wrong side of the law. Tom watched as Karen attempted to go door to door, speaking with neighbors who were once loyal to her. Her attempts to sway public opinion quickly failed. People who had been too afraid to speak up against Karen for so long now openly sided with Tom. They saw him as a hero, the one who had defended the farm against her overreach. The final chapter in this saga came when Karen was publicly reprimanded at the next HOA meeting. The board members, who had previously backed her up, now realized how much damage she had caused to the community. The hoopla surrounding Karen's illegal actions was enough to get her removed from the HOA board and effectively rendered powerless. As for Tom, his farm not only survived the ordeal, but thrived in the wake of it. The farm's reputation had grown, and even more neighbors reached out to offer support. "Don't mess with the sheriff's farm," Tom quipped, reflecting on how his role as sheriff had not only protected his land but had allowed him to bring justice to his community. The tables had turned for Karen, and she would never have the same influence again.